Chapter 8. Wake up. Someone nudged me. Kid, wake up. They're calling in a new group. Chemical Kid, Miss Scarlet, Polar Paul. The receptionist called names off the list. I sat up in my chair and looked beside me at Ruth. You got a little something there. She pointed to my chin. I wiped the drool off. Mighty Mite, Typhoon Timmy, Vicious Violet, and... Other heroes leaned forward in their seats in hopes their names would be next on the list. She paused before she read the last name. And Tom. I looked over at Ruth, my eyes wide. That's you. She pointed at my name tag with her cigarette. Inside, I found myself in the fanciest gymnasium I'd ever seen. State-of-the-art equipment, clean geometrical lines, like something you'd see in Architectural Digest. It didn't even smell bad. A flash of bright metallic silver, and silver bullets stood before us, stopwatch in hand. He explained that today we'd be going through a series of tests. The league would evaluate us at each stage, and from every heat, they'd select some of us to continue on to the next round. By the end of the tests, he said, they'd make their final decision about who made the probationary roster. I looked around at the faces of my competition and wondered if everyone else wanted this as bad as I did, and if they were as scared as I was of not getting it. Silver Bullet continued on for a while about the importance of maintaining perfect physical shape, especially with all the power dampeners out there. The technology is available to any low-level metahuman brazen enough to call himself a villain these days. You have to be ready to fight all the time, even without your powers. He explained the first stage was to be a simple test of our physical fitness and lined each of us up at various stations throughout the room. I wanted to raise my hand and ask him if there was a locker room where I could take off my suit, but he'd already reset the stopwatch ready to go. My sleeves were wet from wiping my forehead. I used my skinny black New Wave tie instead, and it shone slick with sweat. Silver Bullet fired to start a pistol in the air, which seemed like a ridiculous thing to do for a tryout, and we all broke into a sprint. For all the gym's high-tech gadgets and haute design, our first station was just a cleaner, newer version of the same obstacle courses I'd been doing in gym since I was a little kid. Hop quickly through some tires, run a few laps, leap over a few hurdles, climb a rope wall, and there you are. I was so focused on doing my best that I didn't even notice until I got to the rope that I was 2 full lengths ahead of everyone else. Granted, Mighty Mite had to move a lot faster with those puny legs, but I was still kicking ass. I looked over my shoulder and saw Vicious Violet kicking the hurdles into the wall instead of leaping over them. I'd already won the heat by that point anyway. Not bad for a first-timer. I caught my breath and watched Silver Bullet scribble some marks on his clipboard. Looks like all those years of basketball and sports might actually pay off after all. The next station was even more like gym class. All he wanted us to do was bang out as many pull-ups, push-ups, rope jumps, and sit-ups as we could do in the allotted time period. Again, I nailed it, beating everyone in every event until we got to the sit-ups, when Silver Bullet asked us to partner up. I'm not doing it with him, Miss Scarlet, the pizza delivery girl, pointed at me. Everyone else had paired off, and it had left just me and Miss Scarlet, and she wasn't having it. You're also being graded, Silver Bullet said, on teamwork. Miss Scarlet smiled at him, a cute, flirtatious grin, and he smiled back. Then she grabbed my hand and pulled me aside and whispered, "If you look down my shirt, I'll fry your testicles." Her eyes sizzled when she spoke. I went first and did more than 100 sit-ups in a minute, with Miss Scarlet kneeling on the tops of my feet as an anchor. I felt the strain in my abdomen and knew I'd be sore tomorrow. I might be winning these heats, but I'd need to get in better shape if I planned to make the big time. No more mint chocolate chip after dinner, maybe an additional workout at the rec center each morning before school. When it came time to switch, Miss Scarlet lay on the ground and tucked her shirt tail loosely in her waistband and zipped up her red delivery jacket. As I knelt on her feet, she glanced around the room at her competitors, and I thought for a second that she looked like a nervous little girl who'd always been picked last for kickball. Silver Bullet fired his pop gun, and while everyone else cranked out their first 20 or so sit-ups with relative ease and speed, Miss Scarlet took her time, pulling herself up to her knees slowly and gingerly. My knees began to tingle, and she looked at me with flames in her eyes. Suddenly, my knees began to burn like they were on fire. "Ouch!" I pulled away. "You burned me." "No, I didn't." Silver Bullet sped over to mediate. "That hurt," I said. "What's your problem?" If she'd been a guy and this had been a basketball court, I would have pushed her back. "I told you I didn't do it." She got up in my face. "But I might do it now." "Okay, easy now, you two." Silver Bullet pushed us apart. "That's enough teamwork for today." I was still steaming when I walked in the room for my interview. I saw the judges, various members of the league, cracking up with laughter. Miss Scarlet got up from the interviewee's seat, smiled, and thanked them for their time, and told them if they thought that last one was funny, then they just wait until she told them about the one time she had to put out the fire at the Sheridan when they double-booked the Shriners and the Star Trek convention on the same weekend. The heroes laughed again and bid her a fond farewell, and I could tell she charmed the pants off them. She turned to me and brushed a stray strand of hair out of her face with her middle finger. I left the seat warm for you. She breezed out of the room, and I sat down and faced Warrior Woman, the Spectrum, and King of the Sea behind the table. They caught their breath and settled down from all their laughter. Warrior Woman, still chuckling, wiped a tear out of the corner of her eye. Boy, she's kinda nutty, huh? I threw it out there, hoping to break the ice. Their smiles evaporated, and they inspected their new candidate. How so? The Spectrum asked. Uh-oh. What is this saying, nutty? King of the Sea asked the others through his gills. It's just an expression, that's all. The interview hadn't even started, and I was already treading on thin ice. Warrior Woman folded her eyes against the aegis on her chest and furrowed her brow. Maybe we should just get started. I cleared my throat and folded my hands together on the table. If I'd been at church, it would have looked like I was going to pray. My neck itched like crazy under the wetsuit collar. They shuffled through a stack of folders and searched for my file, and the Spectrum asked the first question. What's your power, son? I opened my mouth to answer, but then he pulled out a lime green folder from the bottom of the stack. Bingo, I got it. It says here you can turn into sand. No, I think that's someone else. You can't turn yourself into different silicon-based forms? A giant slide, for instance? A sandstorm? No, that's not me. I scratched under my collar. Are you sure? The Spectrum asked. He flipped through the stack looking for the right file and knocked some papers onto the floor. Pretty sure. So you're saying you cannot turn into any shapes with your power, gurgled King of the Sea, a real quick study. Interesting. No, that's not what I do. Warrior Woman leaned forward and stared me down. Then maybe in the interest of time, you could tell us what it is that you do, I thought she was going to swallow me whole at any moment. I scooched the chair back a little and made a high-pitched squeak like it was scratching a chalkboard. I heal things. They shared a look. What kind of things? Warrior Woman fired off. People, mostly. I did save a plant once. They shared another look. A plant? Spectrum asked. I wanted to wipe the sweat off my forehead. Miss Scarlet really had heated up the seat, and I was boiling. But I didn't want them to think I was nervous, so I didn't call any attention to the sweat on my brow. I wanted them to find me self-assured and confident. If someone's hurt, I can touch them and my hands get really hot, and that's when it starts. The Spectrum scribbled some notes on a pad of paper and asked me a question without looking up. And what happens when you absorb the injury? What do you mean? Where does all the pain go once you're done with the healing? I bit my lower lip. I'd never thought about it. Can you then teleport, convert your skin to diamond, fire beams of energy from your eyes, things like that? I swallowed and wished they'd left a cup of water for me on the table. Well, it used to trigger seizures after I was done, I guess. Seizures? They shot each other a look. You guess? Wonder Woman asked. Well, I used to. I haven't been getting them lately. They gave me long looks and then with serious faces scribbled notes on their pads. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I really didn't know where all the hurt went when I healed. In fact, I don't know all that much about my powers at all. What the hell was I doing here? One more question, Warrior Woman broke the silence. This was shaping up to be a very short interview, and that couldn't be a good thing. Why are you here? I wanted to stop everything right there and ask to see Justice and talk to him about my father. I wanted to bump into Uberman in the hallway and have him whisk me away to the moon or Mars or somewhere very far away where he could point out different galaxies he'd been to. I looked each one of them in the eye and searched for the right words. I don't know how exactly I'm going to make the world better yet, but I'm going to try. After a tense beat, the Spectrum nodded. The others exchanged a look and scribbled more notes. Maybe it was a little on the earnest side, but it was the truth. I think even Warrior Woman gave me a good mark for that one. Suze from Human Resources came out again and passed out another form. She explained that we had to sign one last release form before we were allowed to enter the simulated training arena, known as the STA. Even though all interaction will be computer-generated, she explained, if you sustain any injury, holographic or otherwise, we are not liable. Most of us signed the form and lined up to wait for the door to open. Vicious Violet shredded the form into bits and said there was no way she was going to sign her life away. Mighty Might landed on my shoulder and whispered that Violet was only raising a stink about it because she didn't know how to read or write, couldn't even sign her own name. I had a sudden pang to help, like I did at the center. I could have her working those talons around a pencil and making neat cursive letters in no time. Of course, I wasn't sure I was going to ask without her trying to eat me. Polar Pete, a short, pudgy guy who looked like he'd be more at home at chess club than a superhero tryout, was sweating more than I was, and his power was all about cooling off. What do you think they're going to make us do? I don't know, I said. Probably some simple drills to see how our powers work. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but that kind of anxiety was catchy. I didn't like thinking about it. I heard someone in the last group was wheeled out on a stretcher. Polar Pete wheezed and took a hit off the inhaler attached to the belt around his parka. I was determined to appear brave when that door opened and revealed whatever dangerous scenario they had cooked up for us. I relaxed and breathed deeply through my nose and stared at the floor. Nice tie, Miss Scarlet shoved past me to the front of the line. Very heroic. Our group of wannabes held our breath as Suze collected the waivers and pressed a button on the wall. The door slowly began to lift like a fancy stainless steel version of an automatic garage door. Come on, guys, let's do it! Mighty Mite piped from the floor in a tiny voice that sounded like he'd just taken a few hits off a helium balloon. At the last minute, I stepped in front of Miss Scarlet. No way was I letting her push me to the back of the bus. Our muscles tensed as the door opened all the way. The stainless steel floor and walls of the room slowly faded away, and the next thing we knew, we were standing right in the heart of the city. Typhoon Timmy dodged a taxicab as it zoomed past us. Other tryout groups turned and looked in our direction. The league had assembled all of us together for the big test. I saw Ruth, the old woman from the waiting room, massaging her knee by a hot dog stand. She bought a footlong. Okay, guys, listen up. Golden Boy suddenly appeared in front of us. Here's the scenario. Sergeant Psycho has taken over the city and induced a widespread hallucination of mass hysteria. There's panic in the streets. No problem, Vicious Violet grinned and sharpened her fangs with a manhole. I'll calm them down. We'll be watching you from the console room. Golden Boy pointed to a window high above at the far end of the room. You'll be graded on ability and teamwork, and your primary goal is to ensure the safety of the crowds. We looked up to the control room and saw the league sitting at their judges' table. Miss Scarlet winked at them. Uberman waved back. Oh, and one more thing. Golden Boy turned to us before he left. Sergeant Psycho and his super soldiers have hidden a dirty bomb somewhere near the traffic square. You have 5 minutes before it explodes and takes everyone with it. 5 minutes, gasped Mighty Mite. And counting. Golden Boy looked at his watch and disappeared in a gold flash. Good thing they're starting with the small stuff. What do they do for real training exercises if you make the team? Thwart thermonuclear war? Discover a cure for cancer? Ruth sidled up to me and nudged me in the ribs. Piece of cake, she said through a bite of her hot dog. Help me, help me, help me! A legion of tourists ran screaming past us and knocked over innocent bystanders in their path. We'll take care of this. Typhoon Timmy puffed up his chest and nodded at Polar Pete. Pete raised his hand and a giant wall of ice surrounded most of the stampeding tourists. Timmy summoned a whirlwind to scoop out of harm's way a group of young visitors who were waiting in an endless line for half-price tickets to rent. Another stampede of out-of-towners ran past a building under construction and knocked over the scaffolding, which sent the construction workers tumbling from above. Chemical King and a group of others took to the sky and caught them. Still others engaged various super soldiers in combat. Miss Scarlet bent her knees, ready to leap up and join the battle in the sky. You know, I've got this really bad hangnail, she said to me and sucked on her pinky finger. Maybe you could help me with it when I'm done with the real fighting. And then she was airborne. I looked up at the console room and saw the Spectrum and Warrior Woman nod at each other and then scribbled down something. I wanted to jump in and join the fray and make a difference. I needed to make an impression fast. I looked over and saw Ruth pop the last bit of her hot dog in her mouth. 3 overfed tourist kids ran by, squealing like pigs. Aren't you going to do anything? I asked. Ruth looked up at me and dabbed a glob of mustard on the corner of her mouth. Don't get your knickers in a twist, kid. They're just holograms. She swallowed the bite. First thing you gotta do is find that psycho guy and take him out. Then find the bomb. Then we all go home early. She finished wiping the mustard off her face with a napkin. I ran into the crowd and waved my arms wildly and shouted for the flying heroes to come down. I yelled that we needed to find Sergeant Psycho and cut off the hysteria from the source, but no one would listen. So much for teamwork. 4 minutes, I shouted. We only have 4 minutes left. No one bothered to come down from the sky. Each hero was too busy doing his or her best to rescue any person from harm, or kick the ass of whatever super soldier they could get their hands on, like whoever had the most saves or knockouts at the end of the battle would win the game. A whole lot of good that would do us when the city blew up. I turned back to Ruth. How are we supposed to find this guy? Ruth struck a match in the bottom of her shoe and lit a cigarette. You heal things, right? I nodded my head and waved for her to hurry up with wherever she was going with this. Well, she took a long drag, then you must be able to see what needs healing. Just look for the highest concentration of people who aren't right in the head. Why didn't I think of that? I took a deep breath, massaged my temples for effect just in case the League was watching me, and squinted at all the panicked people in the streets. Sure enough, if I concentrated, I could see an oily blackness swirling around in their heads where their brains were supposed to be. My eyes scanned the crowd and I saw smatterings of people with a black brain goo running away from us and getting corralled in small groups of 2s and 3s by some of the wannabe heroes. My eyes made their way to the center of the square, and I saw more and more people with the blackness in their heads. The largest concentration of swirling blackness appeared in a throng of people standing around a fountain. There must have been hundreds of them, and they were rioting, their brains submerged in oily darkness. The source of the blackness, the largest concentration of dark matter, was crystal clear to me. I pointed to the fountain. "He's over there!" There, in front of the giant statue in the middle of the fountain of Ares, god of war, stood Sergeant Psycho. He cradled his helmet under his arm in emulation of the statue behind him while he commanded his troops in battle. He had one of those crazy gleams in his eye, the kind where the tops of the pupils didn't reach the eyelids. He was safe, blanketed from us by the rioting masses infected by his insanity. "What next?" I asked. "Look for what seems to be out of place." Ruth's attention drifted for a moment to another street vendor. "Do you smell French fries?" I stared closer. There was something off about the statue. Not off, as in how strange it is for a major city of a family values country to have a fountain with a giant statue of a naked pagan war god at its center, but something else. The stone was a pale grayish beige, the same light color khaki you see in the preppy clothes stores. So I thought it was strange that some graffiti artist had gone to all the trouble of painting the helmet black. "Ruth, the bomb! It's in the helmet of the statue!" Ruth picked through a tub of fries and plucked the burned ones out. "What do we do now?" I shouted at Ruth. "We're running out of time." She calmly held 3 fingers in the air, then 2 fingers, then 1, then whoomph! It was the guy from the waiting room who'd had all the sneezing fits and nosebleeds. A super soldier had casually tossed him aside from the fray. "Sorry," he sniffled and wiped his nose with his sleeve. "Quick, what do you do?" I asked. He sniffled again. "I make people sick." Ruth and I shared a look. "What's your name?" "Larry, Typhoid Larry." "Larry, I'm Tom, and this is Ruth. Nice to meet you." I shook his hand and helped him up. He seemed surprised that I would touch him. Ruth held up her hands and wriggled her fingers like she was saying, "Nice to meet you, Larry, but keep your germs to yourself." "Larry, I need you to take out everyone around that fountain for me, especially the crazy guy in the middle. Can you do that?" He grinned. "I can do that." He walked to the edge of the crowd, and his body began to shake, and he broke into a sweat. He pressed his lips together, and his cheeks began to puff out like a bullfrog. Then he doubled over, grabbed his stomach, retched, and threw up on the shoulder of one of the crazed rioters. This caused the rioters to begin dropping one by one to their knees and throwing up on each other. They dropped in a chain reaction like a coil of projectile vomit dominoes, toppling each other over, until finally, at the top of the crowd, Sergeant Psycho's knees buckled and he went down in a pool of his own vomit. I jumped over the convulsing bodies to the center of the fountain and climbed the statue. I glanced at my watch. We only had 20 seconds left. My hands began to heat up, and I felt drawn to touch the bomb inside the helmet. "Tom!" Ruth sidestepped to a puddle of throw up. "I'm not sure you should touch that thing. We only have 10 seconds left." I looked around at all the heroes engaged in combat or rescues, then glanced over at the control booth. Each member of the League was leaning forward and watching expectantly to see what I'd do next. I saw Uberman bite his lip with concern. At that moment, I wanted to impress him more than anything in the world. My hands were scalding hot by now, begging me to place them on the cool, smooth sides of the helmet. I set my palms down on the bomb, and I could immediately feel the energy course through them. Suddenly, the lights of the city flickered like strobe lights. The crowds of people began to digitize, like when you get dirt on your DVD, and the scene pauses and the images become pixelated. I smelled burned plastic and saw a trickle of smoke rising from my hands. Then I heard a sickening whir, and the entire hologram of the city, people and all, faded away. The next thing I knew, we were enveloped in darkness. "Tom?" I heard Ruth ask, but I couldn't tell from which direction. Suddenly, the floorboards ignited and exploded, revealing machinery on fire underneath. The tryout heroes screamed and dodged the flames and shrapnel. An emergency siren howled, and I blacked out. "You short-circuited the entire STA." The Spectrum wrapped a bandage around my forearm, where a stray piece of shrapnel had grazed me. "I short-circuited your what?" I asked. "You burned out the whole simulated training area," Warrior Woman said. "You're lucky no one was hurt." "If Silver Bullet and I hadn't been able to extinguish the fire with our own super speed, I hate to think what might have happened," Golden Boy chimed in. He dropped an empty fire extinguisher next to my foot, and it landed on the floor with a clang. Silver Bullet pinched the space above his nose between his eyes as if a migraine were coming on. "This is going to take months to rebuild." I sat up and saw the entire group of tryouts surrounding me in what remained of the burned-out room. I tugged at the bandage on my arm. "You're fine. It's just a scratch," the Spectrum assured me. I wasn't fine, though. I was more humiliated than I'd ever been in my entire life. I could have been stark naked and I wouldn't have felt any worse. It wasn't only the 100 young hero wannabes who stared at me like I was the world's biggest loser, but each member of the league was there too, Uberman included. I tried to make eye contact with him, but he dodged it. "Okay, people, let's go," he shouted and clapped his hands once. "Free refreshments in the commissary." Miss Scarlet nudged past me. "Nice going, Supergirl." None of the other candidates would even look at me as they filed out of the room. Ruth helped me up. Went a little overboard there on the whole save the day thing, don't you think? She lit a cigarette and offered me one. I waved it away. Still, she sucked in a long drag. "Didn't see anybody else stopping that bomb from going off, did you?" I thought about it and she was right. I wanted to say thanks, but my mouth was dry, the corners caked with white, the residue of too many nerves. "Here, I've got some diabetic candy in my purse somewhere." She offered me a hard candy, and I unwrapped it and popped it in my mouth. It tasted like stale butterscotch. "Let's go to the commissary." She put her arm around my shoulders and led me off. I saw we were going to pass Uberman, who was standing at the door, and I wanted to tell Ruth that we should go another way or wait a minute or two, but I didn't want her to pick up on the fact that I was avoiding him. The woman was pretty damn intuitive, and I knew she'd put two and two together. "Tom." Just before we got to the door, I turned around and saw Larry. "Not now, Larry." I turned back toward Uberman. Soon I was going to pass by him close enough to smell the peppermint on his breath. "But Tom," I turned around exasperated. "What?" I've been trying to tell you I was happy you shook my hand. People usually don't like to touch me." "Why's that?" I felt an uncontrollable urge bubble up in my stomach, and the next thing I know, I'd thrown right up in front of Uberman. The refreshments they served were worse than the kind we got in school whenever they had to throw together some lame reception for parents' night. I took a half-hearted bite of a cookie to get the taste of throw-up out of my mouth and chucked it in a wastebasket when I couldn't figure out if it was peanut butter or gingerbread. Ruth took a sip of her Kool-Aid and handed me a Dixie cup. "Here, drink this. It'll make you feel better." I took a sip, and they must have put way too much powder in the drink because it burned my throat as it went down. Suze from Human Resources stood at the podium in front of the room and tapped the microphone. High-pitched screeches whistled through the room. "Is this thing on?" Feedback howled and everyone covered their ears. "If I can have everyone's attention, please." She put her finger over her lips and shushed the crowd. The chatter died down, and 100 eager heroes listened tentatively in hopes they'd hear their names called for the next round. "You can all continue enjoying the refreshments. In a few moments, we'll be posting the results. Thank you." Good thing this woman didn't do crisis intervention and management. The poor thing had 0 people skills, and I'm not even going to mention her hair. "I just wanted to say thanks for coming in." Golden Boy was upon me in an instant, and he shook my hand intently, the hint of a smile creeping around the corners of his mouth. "Sorry things didn't work out." The news hit me like he'd flung a pillowcase of bricks into my stomach. After I'd ruined all of that expensive equipment, I suppose I didn't really harbor much hope for making the cut, but still, to hear that they didn't want me after all was incredibly painful, especially coming from this jackass. I did my best to make sure none of my emotions showed on my face, and I shook his hand back. "Maybe next year," he said, and then sped off. I wish I'd yacked on his boots. Suze and the receptionist caused quite a stir in the crowd when they brought out the lists. The heroes gathered around them and tried to get an early glimpse as they taped the lists on the wall. The two women disappeared in a sea of costumes as the entire room converged on the spot. Miss Scarlet flew up into the air, flipped over, and pumped her fist and hollered, "Woohoo!" Guess she'd made it. Some wannabe heroes reacted with elation, others hunched their shoulders despondent. I didn't see any reason to stay and punish myself any more than necessary, so I put Dad's coat back on and made my way out the door. On the way out, I saw Ruth standing in the corner, her back turned to the crowd. She pulled a flask out of her poncho and poured the remainder of its contents into the Kool-Aid. I stormed down the hallway and looked for the nearest exit. I mean, who were they to cut me? Sure, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I had to have more sense than the pizza delivery girl. Besides, they were the ones who invited me to join in the first place. I didn't ask for this, and it wasn't fair for them to get my hopes up like that. They were seasoned enough to know whether I had the right stuff to make it before I came to embarrass myself. Maybe this is some idea of a sick joke. Maybe the reason I'd never heard of Justice was because he and my dad hated each other, and maybe the reason Justice invited me in the first place was to be cruel to the son of his ex-mentor. What kind of prick does that kind of thing? I mean, shouldn't he be figuring out new ways to save the world instead of spending his time humiliating kids? And where the hell was I anyway? I looked down the corridor, a long stretch of industrial pilings and detritus that cast long shadows on the concrete. I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. I spotted an exit sign at the end of the complex, and I could have sworn I saw a black cape swirl behind one of the pilings, but I was too mad to care. I was the one who'd stopped the threat and saved the day back in the simulated training area. I deserved to make that team more than anyone else. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. They weren't going to walk all over me. I turned around. I was going back to give those assholes a piece of my mind. I walked back into the reception room and pushed through the crowd toward the dais and the podium. I bumped into Polar Pete, who sizzled when he smacked into Miss Scarlet, who was busy telling more stories about herself to a captivated Wonder Woman. Justice hovered on the dais, his back to the crowd, in intense discussion with Silver Bullet and Golden Boy, who were probably plotting new ways to torture me, new ways to kick dirt in my dad's face. Golden Boy didn't like the plan because he was shaking his head. Well, they were going to have to do a whole lot better than this if they wanted us Creeds to feel bad. If they thought they could hurt me or Dad just by messing with my head at a tryout and cutting me from the team, they had another thing coming. If there's one thing we Creeds know how to succeed at, it was failure. I approached Justice, ready to chew him out. I was going to tell him off for abandoning my father when he needed him the most, reminding him that he was supposed to live up to his name, and not just when the cameras were rolling. I poked Justice on the shoulder with my index finger like I was mashing a beetle into his back. He turned his head, and I spun him around by his shoulders. Shock registered on Silver Bullet's and Golden Boy's faces. My lower lip trembled, and a new thought suddenly entered my head. Screw the speech. I wanted to clock him. I clenched my fist, and Justice looked at me surprised. Congratulations, Tom. You made the team.